When did popular music start? Well now, that's a tricky question. A lot of people say in the early or mid-1950s with the birth of rock and roll. I'm not going to argue against that. It's a good jumping off point for understanding where our music has come from. But I'm going to offer an earlier date, 1923. That's when two blues singers, Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey, were first recorded. Mamie Smith had made the first blues vocal recording in 1920, but 1923 was when the style exploded into mainstream popularity. While Ma Rainey was important and something of a mother figure to a lot of early blues singers, we're going to focus on Bessie Smith. She embodied something important as both a singer and as a woman, something that we can recognize today. Designed to be safe, she was anything but. There are times in music history where things seem too dangerous.
I want you to kill everyone over there! And I want you to kill everybody over there!
Where the men with the money try to tame the art. In the early 1900s, a style called the blues was emerging from old slave work songs and spirituals. Many of its early pioneers were men, but they were not the sort of men good honest folk would want to be seen with. They were the descendants of slaves, living in a country that didn't want them, that resented them, that in many ways spent its time trying to replace the shackles of old with laws to bind and oppress. So they often found themselves on the wrong side of things. They were murderers and thieves, disturbers of the peace. And so the men with the money decided they would promote their softer sisters. It is no accident that most famous early blues records were by women. Women were safe. Women were decent, tame. Women had the sort of character that decent people, respectable people, could listen to. Then along came Bessie Smith.
I need a little sugar in my bowl. I need a little hot dog on my roll. I can stand.
She was a woman, but she was by no means tame. Her early songs centered on the classic blues theme of "My love has done me wrong." Within a few years, she was tackling much more risque material, with the song Empty Bed Blues being the best example. Every verse turns up the innuendo until we get, "He boiled my first cabbage and he made it awful hot. When he put in the bacon, it overflowed the pot."
He bought my first cabbage and he made it awful hot. He bought my first cabbage and he made it awful hot. Then he put in the bacon, it overflowed the pot. When you get good loving.
It's funny how, living in a world where you can sing anything, as long as you're not fussed about radio play, or you do a radio version, we miss out on one of the best things about old songs, that they had to find different ways of saying things. They had to play with language. And without doubt, the blues singers of the 20s, 30s, and 40s did some of the most imaginative playing, perhaps made most famous by that early but much covered blues classic, "You got the right key, baby, but the wrong key hold." Tragically, Bessie Smith's career didn't much outlive the 1920s. When the Great Depression arrived in 1929, the bottom fell out of the recording industry. It eventually revived, but music had changed by then. She tried to adapt to the new swing era, but it was clear that her earlier blues records were always going to be her best work. She died in a car accident in 1937. 20 years later, and history was about to repeat itself. The early rock and roll stars were all men, and they were dangerous. It's easy to forget that Elvis spent most of his early interviews batting away questions about the terrible damage his shaking hips were doing to children at the time. It's easy to forget that the film Rock Around the Clock was banned in lots of cinemas because teenagers were tearing up the seats to make room to dance. Elvis joined the army, not to seem tough or manly, but to seem like a nice, patriotic young man. And so, as the 50s gave way to the 60s, the men with the money once again wanted to present a more tame version of pop music. and once again turned to women. The Chiffons, the Shirelles, the Shangri-Las all made names for themselves singing about love and loss. They were actually a lot more tame than the jazz singers of the 1920s had been, but in the early, mid-1960s, the Ronettes were as big as any girl group of the era. They befriended the Beatles on a UK tour in 1964, and later toured with them on what was to be the final ever tour for the boys from Liverpool in 1966. Their lead singer, Ronnie Bennett, she married Phil Spector in 1968, was part of a new breed of pop divas. In live performances, you can see that she's not quite as polished as maybe the businessmen would like. Like Bessie Smith, she's not tame. And the screaming fans aren't quite so many, but are easy to compare to those that followed those four famous boys from Liverpool around. Ronnie Spector was a star, and the spirit of independence she brought to her performances was an inspiration for the performers who would follow. In classic 60s feminist style, it wasn't a car crash that derailed Ronnie's career, it was a marriage. She married Phil Spector in 1968, and aside from countless other abuses, wasn't allowed to perform. They divorced in 1974, but as with Bessie Smith and Swing, the musical sands had shifted considerably. The Ronettes were reformed, but never managed to recapture the magic of the early 60s. Her solo career during the 70s and 80s was mixed. The lesson isn't that either Bessie Smith or Ronnie Spector became less talented, but simply that their initial success was what defined them throughout their careers, and continues to define them both to this day. Bessie Smith died almost 100 years ago. Ronnie Spector passed just days ago. Yet both represent the futile effort to tame female artists to make pop music more palatable for polite society. Perhaps it isn't just these women who can't be tamed, perhaps it is music itself. Maybe there is something in the intersection of what makes us human and what makes us create, which is simply untamable. Maybe that is the essence of what makes us truly free, in spite of abuse and oppression and greed. What makes us free is that simple human capacity to create, to invent that which is beyond ourselves.